Welcome back to another episode of Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue Playlist. What are we talking about today, Ashley?
We were really lucky to be able to actually interview someone in an AE seat for this episode, which in hindsight, it's very weird that this is the first one that we recorded, but it was. And it was actually a really cool conversation, I think, with someone who's seen it all.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely kicked off the first season with a lot of what I would call established names, like well-known women leaders in the revenue space, everything from CEOs to CROs to CMOs, a lot of C-suite ladies who we all love and want to support. But something that you and I both talked about before starting this entire project is that we did not want to be just another women in leadership podcast or project. We wanted to elevate voices of people that maybe don't typically get a platform or podcast guest opportunities and whatnot. And it took us a while to actually get around to recording with someone who was in more of an IC role. But Christie Young, who was our guest, was the first. And I think it was just proof that younger women, even though they're junior in their experience, have a lot to say, a lot of important things to say and things that are worth listening to. And I think she really blew me away in the conversation of just how like confident and successful and incredible of a seller she was. And she's went from SDR to AE, and like that's the extent of her experience. And I still learned a lot from chatting with her.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important for us is layering in voices that people are excited to hear from because they've heard of them with people who have the experience, are in the trenches, but maybe aren't like an influencer on LinkedIn, right? So this was a really good example of that because she's doing the job. We started out this conversation talking about how she hit not just her ramping quota as an AE, but she actually hit a full seller's quota and made it to President's Club her first year in a closing role in 20-3. Like,
that was a hard year to sell. So.
That's insane. And it's really cool to hear from somebody who did that because it's like the cream of the crop, right? She wasn't out there talking about it on LinkedIn, so you may not recognize her name, but she was doing the work and she got rewarded for it. And I think that's really cool. One of the things she talks about is that owning your story and being able to tell it is really important. And I think that that's a good takeaway from this episode because she very clearly knows where she can improve. She knows to lean into mentors. She knows to take feedback in interviews and do the thing that she was coached to do on the next one. So it's really important to tell your story if you can. It doesn't matter if you have those gaps because you'll be able to sell yourself.
So let's dig into owning your story because I feel like you, of all people, would have a really unique perspective on how to do that.
Are we getting into that today?
I think we should. I really think we should because you are a very successful seller, but if a random recruiter took a look at your resume, they might have some question marks based on a few little stints there. And I want to talk about like if someone asks you about that, I mean, you just landed a new job a few months ago. How do you talk about it? Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people are in similar boats.
Well, for starters, if you are loud and proud and tell your story on LinkedIn or some kind of social, you don't actually have to use your resume sometimes. I actually did not use my resume for my past 2 jobs that I've gotten. They never asked for one. They didn't need one. They knew who I was. So there's that. I'm very, very lucky that that's my reality. 2, yes, I have a very, very interesting story. I left a job that I was at for a long time for tech, right? Like 2.5 years, something like that. That's a
you
good
went through an
chunk
acquisition,
of time.
So it was
correct. Yeah,
complex, a lot of layers and whatnot.
Complex, but like stuck it out. And I can tell that story that I was able to navigate an acquisition. I was able to find my space at a new organization, even if it wasn't what I chose. So there's that piece. Like that is a strike in my favor. However, when I left that job, I did take a role that didn't work out for me. And the reasons for that, we don't necessarily need to get into that here. But I will say, as someone who's really outspoken about women and being treated correctly in the workplace, I felt that my personal beliefs just could not align with sticking it out at that organization. Mental health of my own aside, I don't think it's okay to be someone who preaches like, know your value, know your worth, speak up. and just put up with something that's toxic. So I did leave a job after 9 weeks, and that was a really difficult decision, and I didn't have something lined up, and I was afraid. One of my biggest fears was that I was going to be judged for that, right? But I had an established relationship with the company that I'm at now, and they had been pursuing me for a long time. So it's not like the normal situation, because this other company, the one that I'm at right now, aligns with my personal values. And I did go through a full interview process, had to prove that I knew what I was doing. I had a writing assignment, all that good stuff, interviews. But so I didn't just get handed that on a platter. But me having that short stint, that was actually a value add, because I did know my worth and I was able to speak to it and say, I did leave this job. It wasn't for me. I didn't trash the other job. I didn't have to, but I could say, this wasn't for me. Your values line with my values, and that's what I want to work for. So I'll get off my
Obviously it's
soapbox
a
now.
very unique situation for you in particular, and I can't really speak to this because I was at my first job for 2 years, which I guess is kind of short in terms of like career, but
Not
2 years is
anymore.
established. Then I was at a company for 3.5 years, and now I've been at this company for 3.5 years, ComStor. And I'm sticking it out. I'm gonna be here
You
until
better.
no, I'm here forever. Shout out Mac. Anyways, I guess confidence aside, owning your story aside, like what advice would you give to someone that did just get laid off after 2 months, and maybe they got laid off before that because it's a really tough market, right? Like it's not always your fault, especially in sales, right? You are tied to a revenue goal, and it's very easy for a leader to look at that and say, you didn't bring in revenue immediately, you're a weak link, you're gone, right? Like that's an easy slash, I think, in a difficult economic environment. So like, let's say someone has gone through 3-4 layoffs, and it was kind of out of their control. How would you frame that? I mean, I know you haven't gone through that yourself, but you've had a similar-ish situation. I haven't. I'm just curious, like, how you
Yeah.
would tell someone to approach that.
So I think it really depends on a lot of factors. If it's someone who has been learning out loud and has like a social presence, it's a very different conversation than someone who hasn't. And there's no shame at all if you haven't, because I imagine a lot of these people that are going through these layoffs, and I know this because I've had some of them reach out to me, they didn't they were focused on their job. They weren't posting things on LinkedIn. Maybe they're not comfortable with it. Like it's hard to do that. It's never too late to start. So I would say, like, join the conversation, find community. I do think, like, I'm not saying this just because ComSort is a community kind of tool, but I do think that there's just most of the happy endings that I've heard, most of the stories that are career paths that were really, really like unique and cool, they came because someone leaned into their network, because they knew somebody, because they were able to speak out loud so other people kind of knew who they were talking to before they got in the door.
Not to make this a ComSor plug,
Go
but I
ahead.
mean, everything you said just resonates with what we're building as a company, because the whole idea behind this term go to network is that if you go to market as an individual or as a company, it is so much easier to do it with other people together. And joining these communities, a lot of them have formal mentorship programs, so it's a great place to start. Or like you seek them out yourself. Do you see someone posting in there about topics that are relevant to you all the time? Comment on it. Tell them like, hey, I also care about this thing. Let's get on a virtual coffee and chat, right? And you never know what that might lead to. That's why we have this podcast, right? You and I joined Gong's online customer community, and we got randomly connected in ComStore's product Matcha. And 3 years later, we've got a meetup and a podcast together. So,
And more to come.
and more to come. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I
Personally.
also really appreciated Christie's point of view in that conversation, because normally a lot of the women that we have on talk about the negative sides
Mm-hmm.
of being a woman in revenue, which it can be so easy to focus on the negatives, like in life in general, right? Like it's so easy to complain about the hard stuff. And she came to that conversation being like, honestly, I've had a great time as a woman in sales. Like I haven't had any major no hurdles of like harassment or like being targeted for being a woman in revenue. I've had a great time. I've had mentors that were men. I've had people elevate me that were men. I've had a great time hitting President's Cup. And I think sometimes we're even guilty of this. It's so easy to focus on the negatives and talk about like what was something you had to overcome as a woman in sales. And it is a superpower. And sometimes it's good to be reminded that it is a net positive at the end of the day. And as long as we stick together and keep that herd mentality and our community strong, like we're going to crush it.
She embodies the confidence and the mindset that I think we all need to be successful in our roles. And it's really rare to see a woman featured the way that she was on this podcast episode, where she's not only showing up without putting makeup on, we talked about this, and not caring and owning it and saying, that's not the point. I'm here to do good work. And it's not about me looking pretty on camera. And she says, yes, I did it. I made President's Club. I crushed my goals. I leaned into mentors. I did these things. Like, it is so important for other women to see that.
The episode with Christie, I think, is actually one of my favorite yet, because it is such a unique perspective from the typical guests that we have on. Not that the other guests aren't equally as amazing, but I highly suggest everyone go and listen to it. Follow her on LinkedIn. I don't think she's super active, but she's around. It's Christie Young at Collibra. She's an account executive. You can find us on all the usual platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think.
ComSoar is the complete suite of tools for teams looking to grow, activate, and engage their networks. If you enjoyed the learnings and banter in this episode, there's more where this came from. Follow Ashley and Katrina's Infinite Revenue playlist wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. See you next time.